Since the beginning of humanity, flight has been a dream as ancient as time itself. And the Greek myth of Icarus and Daedalus is one of the earliest stories to connect humanity's desire to fly with tragedy. Daedalus was an exceptionally skilled Athenian architect and inventor, and Icarus was his son. He was neither a hero nor a demigod. He was raised among tools, inventions, and secrets, alone beside his father. On the island of Crete, where kings made pacts with gods and punishment was measured through mythology, King Minos ordered the construction of an impossible prison, a cell not for men, but for a monster, the Minotaur, a beast born from desire and punishment, the result of a curse cast upon the wife of Minos. But when Minos suspected that the secret of the labyrinth could escape through the lips of Daedalus himself, he did not hesitate to imprison the architect alongside his son. Not inside the labyrinth, but within a tower without doors, a prison without bars, with the sky as its only escape. Daedalus spent a long time observing the behavior of the birds that flew near their prison. Inspired by them, he began collecting feathers carried by the wind and storing them in secret. Once he had gathered enough, he used melted candle wax to bind the feathers onto lightweight wooden frames that could imitate wings. As the days passed, he managed to build 2 pairs of wings, one for himself and one for his son. One morning, when the wind was gentle and the sun had only just begun to rise above the sea, Daedalus saw an opportunity. His son Icarus, though still young, had helped his father and had witnessed all of his work. He was impatient, not out of disobedience, but because for the first time in a long while, he no longer saw walls, only the sky. As he handed him the wings, his father gave him only one warning: do not fly too low because of the sea's moisture, nor too high, for the sun could melt the wax. But Icarus had his eyes fixed on the horizon, not on his father. At first, they flew in silence, and Icarus stayed close by his side. The fishermen watching them from below believed they were gods with human wings. The thrill of flight was something entirely new, and Icarus shouted with joy and laughed as though it were a game. That frightened his father deeply. But by then, it was already too late. The wings began to fail, the feathers started falling away, and Icarus could no longer hold himself in the air. He struck the water violently and perhaps struggled for a few desperate seconds. His father, upon seeing him fall, could neither turn nor descend to save him, for the wings were not modern and had no real control or direction. Fear paralyzed him. He circled above the sea until he saw the feathers floating on the water. Then he descended onto a nearby island and named that sea after his son. It is said that he never flew again, and perhaps kept the wings only as a memory of him. But the idea did not disappear. Throughout the centuries, the desire to fly survived. Before engines or airplanes ever existed, there were already those who tried to challenge the wind. 9th century, a time when Greek, Persian, Hindu, and Arab knowledge merged under Islam. Knowledge itself was considered sacred. Within the Islamic state of the Umayyad Emirate of Al-Andalus, what is now the city of Córdoba, in southern Spain, became one of the most advanced centers in the world. It was a cosmopolitan place filled with poets, mathematicians, musicians, physicians, astronomers, and philosophers. Its cities had public baths, libraries, gardens, and illuminated streets, while much of the rest of Europe remained consumed by war and obscurity. Yet, our journey toward flight begins here. Abbas Ibn Firnas was neither a soldier nor a nobleman, but a man of wisdom. For years, he studied many different disciplines, including music, poetry, and the design of clocks. He was not interested in fame or wealth, but in understanding the world. He became part of the intellectual circle protected by the court of Emir Abd al-Rahman II, and after the emir's death, that support continued under the rule of his son, Muhammad I of Córdoba. He was a cultured man and a poet who supported mathematicians, translators, and astronomers. However, he also encouraged conversion to Islam within the administration. Even so, He did not forbid science or persecute others, so long as they did not directly challenge religion. Respected as a wise man, he lived with access to materials, books, and workshops. He devoted much of his life to study, which made him a solitary man. What fascinated him most was the movement of birds. Though in that era, flight was seen as something belonging to angels, geniuses, or divine creatures. At the age of 42, he began studying flight, and by the year 875, at 65 years old, he believed he had gathered enough knowledge. For several weeks, he remained in his workshop, tirelessly at work, and among fabrics, rods, and calculations, he built a pair of wings made of wooden frames, silk, and feathers fastened together with beeswax. When he believed the moment had come, he stepped outside and invited anyone who wished to witness it. By the next day, a crowd had gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others out of morbid fascination, and others simply wanted to see a man attempt to fly. From a tower in Cordoba, he attempted something no one had ever done before. As he climbed, he looked upon the city, the river, the rooftops, and perhaps the boundary between reason and madness. Upon reaching the top, he spread his arms, closed his eyes, and leapt into the void. He did not fly like a bird, but for a few brief seconds, he flew like a man trying to understand the wind, though not completely. Then he began to fall. His back struck the ground hard. Some rushed to help him, others laughed, others believed he had died, but he survived. The physicians of the court treated him. He remained bedridden and in pain for days. He recovered slowly, though the pain in his back stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was accused of arrogance, yet the emir never punished him. He understood that the attempt had not come from vanity, and he continued to respect him as a wise man. Years later, Abbas returned to his inventions. He would design lenses and polish crystals. He never flew again, nor did he ever speak of flight again. He died 12 years later, in the same place where he had attempted to fly, Cordoba, around the year 887. Some believe the injuries from his fall contributed to his decline. It is said that he reflected upon his mistake, not having built a mechanism for landing safely, and although the wind denied him the future, the sky granted him a place in history. But now, centuries later, another man also looked toward the sky, yet he did so from the shadows of silence and faith. In the 10th century, within the Kingdom of Wessex, there stood an important Benedictine monastery on the hill of Malmesbury, Wiltshire, England. It was a religious and cultural centre, home to the second largest library in Europe. Malmesbury was a burh, a fortified settlement established by Alfred the Great to resist Viking attacks. The monastery was the educational and cultural heart of the city. There, the sky was observed, prayers were spoken, and monks were trained. It was considered a place of intellectual prestige in its time. Eilmer of Malmesbury, also known as Elmer or Oliver. From a young age, he studied astronomy and mathematics, disciplines common within intellectual life at the monastery. The emerging medieval technology of that era showed growing curiosity about the mechanics of the air. Within the monastery, monks could pursue experiments without immediately being condemned as heretics. Flight was viewed with awe, as a bridge between the human and the divine. During his early years as a monk, he lived within the Benedictine Abbey, sharing his days with dozens of other monks, each with different duties. He carefully observed the birds gliding above the valley, and at times, the clear sky invited him to study the stars. Surrounded by ancient texts, Eilmer discovered something that would not let him sleep: the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus. Inspired, he decided to build a pair of wings within the monastery workshops, likely made from lightweight wood, cloth, fine leather, and a harness fastened to his hands and feet. It took him several weeks, a reasonable amount of time for a skilled and meticulous monk. The abbot forbade him nothing. He was not stopped while researching or building his wings, for he was a respected monk. One day, around the year 1010, he decided to climb to the highest point of the abbey tower, through fog, stone walls, and sheep grazing below. Below, Malmesbury slept quietly, as small cities of that era often did. Eilmer gathered his courage and leapt from one of the monastery's high towers, managing to glide through the air for several seconds. But he failed to properly calculate the landing. The impact was sudden and violent, causing fractures in both of his legs. The pain was surely as deep as his desire to fly. Even so, he survived, though the injuries would remain with him for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was the same shepherds or monks watching from afar who ran to help him. They carried him back to the monastery. There he remained resting, burdened by the frustration of his broken dream. He thought about trying again, but the abbot, horrified, forbade him from repeating the feat for fear that he would lose his life. The abbot confiscated his materials and prohibited any second attempt. His long life suggests that he remained lucid and active. He likely helped copy texts and continued teaching. He died within the abbey, perhaps in his own cell, surrounded by fellow monks who respected him at an advanced age, around the year 1069. Although his flight was never recorded in technical manuals nor celebrated in public squares, he lived long enough to tell the story, and his story survived through time thanks to the chronicler Eilmer of Malmesbury. Flight was the desire to rise above, and not every man who dreamed of the sky would ever reach it. We are now in the 15th century, during the Italian Renaissance, a period of artistic, cultural, and scientific explosion. Europe was overflowing with ideas, and the Italian city-state stood at the heart of this transformation. Here was born Leonardo da Vinci in Anciano, a small village near Vinci in Tuscany. From childhood, he developed a deep connection with observing the world around him. He was never legally recognized because he was born out of wedlock, though his father remained present during important moments of his life. During adolescence, his talent drew attention, and he was sent to Florence to study in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. It was no ordinary school. There, he learned art, sculpture, engineering, anatomy, and mechanics. He drew tirelessly, constantly taking notes and analyzing everything he saw. As the years passed, and after learning from his master, he began seeking more ambitious projects. In Florence, he worked as both an artist and an engineer, but later presented himself before Ludovico Sforza in Milan, offering his services as a military engineer. During his time there, he not only worked in engineering, but also began something that would obsess him for years: the study of flight. Leonardo studied the air as though it were a physical substance. He analyzed currents, pressure, and resistance, while also observing the flight of birds and bats, especially the way they glided and flapped their wings. From these observations, his first flying machines were born. The ornithopter attempted to make the human body imitate the natural flight of birds. He also reflected on falling and designed a device shaped like a fabric pyramid supported by wood, the earliest known concept of a parachute. As the years passed, he gradually abandoned flapping wings and began designing rigid wing machines similar to gliders. At that moment, Leonardo understood something fundamental. The human body cannot fly without mechanical assistance. He never built real machines. He had neither engines nor materials strong enough, and the pulleys and ropes of his time were insufficient. Furthermore, no one financed projects related to flight. The wealthy men who supported artists were far more interested in his talent for hydraulic engineering, art, and military design. His designs remained as ideas far ahead of their time, barely understood by those who saw them. He chose to keep moving forward. He worked for different patrons, traveled between Italian cities, and endured political changes. In his final years, he lived in France under the protection of King Francis I. There, he stopped actively working on flight and devoted himself to organizing his manuscripts and reflecting upon his ideas, finding in philosophy and painting a more stable refuge. He died in 1519 at the age of 67 in Clos-Lucé, a residence located in Amboise near the royal castle. Everything we know about his dreams of flight survives thanks to his closest disciple, Francesco Melzi, who preserved his manuscripts. Leonardo could not conquer the sky, but he taught humanity how to understand it. We have reached the midpoint of our journey, but this time we will not witness a solitary flight, but the teamwork of two brothers. We travel now to France in the mid-18th century under the reign of Louis XV, whose monarchy was both extravagant and powerful. More than 200 years had passed since the death of Leonardo. The idea of flight no longer sounded as absurd as it once had. Some nobles had begun sponsoring scientific experiments as a form of entertainment. Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne were two of the many children of Pierre Montgolfier, a successful paper manufacturer who lived and worked in the small industrial village of Vidalon-les-Annonay. It was located in the northern part of Ardèche, within the Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region in southeastern France. The family home stood beside the Doum River, surrounded by gentle hills, green fields, and an ancient viaduct. There stood the family paper mill. Each morning, they awoke to the sound of water flowing and people working along the riverbanks. Stone walls echoed with the sounds of machinery and the faint smoke drifting from the factory. These two brothers lived happily, learning the family trade. Joseph, the elder brother, had already shown curiosity about mechanics, physics, and inventions by the age of 10. He was considered a dreamer. Etienne, on the other hand, was more academic and organized. He was sent to Paris to study commerce. Meanwhile, Joseph began developing technical interests and ideas. His curiosity grew, and he began experimenting alone while working in the factory. In time, Etienne completed his studies and returned home. His family welcomed him warmly, and he joined the management of the paper mill. During those years, Joseph developed ideas about heated air, a subject already being discussed in Europe, though still poorly understood. One morning in November of 1782, in the garden of the family home, Joseph noticed that the hot air produced by burning paper caused a small fabric bag to rise. In that moment, the idea of flight began to take shape. He wrote to his brother, who was possibly away on business, convincing him to join the project. With Etienne now involved, and after several weeks of constant work, they managed to create a lightweight balloon made of paper and fabric, supported by a delicate internal framework of ropes that maintained its shape and stability. The morning of June 4th, 1783, was carefully chosen for its weather conditions. Gentle winds and clear skies. The brothers awoke before sunrise. Joseph had barely slept. He was anxious over the calculations written by hand. Etienne, methodical as always, reviewed the list of materials for the balloon one more time. Determined, they headed toward the square of Annonay before representatives of the scientific community. The authorities, curious yet skeptical, surrounded the strange device. With the sun touching the rooftops, they lit the fire. The hot air began filling the interior of the balloon. And so it began to rise, and it flew. The brothers watched it drift away, as though a part of their souls floated alongside it. For 10 minutes, it remained in the air, traveling nearly 2 kilometers. It landed gently on the outskirts of Annonay. The brothers arrived expecting to find only scattered remains across the field, but their creation was still intact. The flight sparked the interest of the Scientific Academy, and news of it soon reached the royal court at Versailles. 1 week later, the Montgolfier brothers were summoned to give a demonstration before the king. On September 19, 1783, the gardens of the Palace of Versailles filled with curious spectators. An enormous balloon, decorated with blue and golden fabrics, awaited its unusual crew. A sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Each one represented a different part of terrestrial physiology. In the eyes of the 18th century, this was considered a rigorous scientific experiment. The fire, fueled by straw and wool, began filling the balloon with hot air. It remained in the air for 8 minutes at an altitude of around 600 meters, traveling nearly 3 kilometers before the wind carried it toward a nearby field. The guards followed the balloon's descent, followed closely by the Montgolfier brothers. The animals survived without suffering any effects from the altitude, though the rooster had a minor injury. Apparently, it had been struck during the flight. King Louis XVI was astonished and authorized a flight with human passengers. In Paris, Joseph and Etienne spent weeks carefully working on a new, larger balloon capable of carrying the weight of 2 people. But before sending man toward the sky, they conducted one final test on the morning of October 15th, while the balloon was still tethered to the ground. This allowed them to improve control and make final adjustments to the craft. On the morning of November 21st of that same year, Paris awoke beneath clear skies. In the gardens, a crowd gathered, ladies with fans, nobles wearing powdered wigs, scientists, soldiers, and even street vendors stopped to watch. The balloon seemed like a great sphere breathing beneath the touch of heat. The king granted permission to proceed, but he did not wish to risk the lives of the brothers. At first, it was believed the first passengers would be condemned criminals. But the Marquis d'Arlandes and Pilatre de Rosier, a professor of physics, persuaded the royal court and volunteered for the flight. Both men stepped onto the platform, bidding farewell with a gesture as the ropes were slowly released while the clock struck 1:54 in the afternoon. Pilatre wrote notes while d'Arlandes waved his hat from the heights above. They flew over Paris, the Seine River, and the rooftops of Notre Dame. They remained in the air for 25 minutes, traveling approximately 9 kilometers at an altitude close to 1,000 meters. The balloon descended outside the city in a controlled landing. That day became engraved in the memory of France as a symbol of ingenuity. For the first time, humanity had flown, not with wings, but with fire and science. Their surnames spread throughout France, and nobles and scientists alike wanted to question them endlessly. But they returned to what was theirs, the paper mill in Vidalon, the very one their father had entrusted to them since their youth. Joseph Michel died in 1810 at the age of 69 in Ballaruc-les-Bains, France, most likely of natural causes. His brother Jacques Etienne had passed away earlier, in 1799, dying far from his hometown in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. They never witnessed the age of airships, engines, or the metal wings that would come afterward, but they left behind something that soared higher than air itself, an idea and a shared dream. The world kept turning. Monarchies fell. Revolutions came and went. Nearly a century later, balloons were no longer viewed as marvelous salon attractions, but as relics of traveling fairs. Even though the Montgolfier brothers had experimented with hot air, no machine yet existed that could truly fly like a bird. Yet someone would attempt it. His name was Otto Lilienthal, and his dream would not involve bags of air, but wings. In Anklam, then part of Prussia and now Germany, Otto was born. He spent hours observing storks in the northern skies, above meadows and windmills. He was fascinated by the way they spread their wings and floated effortlessly through the air. His brothers Gustave and Marie supported him, but above all, his brother Gustave, with whom he would share his study of flight. In time, he attended technical schools in Potsdam and Berlin, where he trained as an engineer. He studied the flight of birds and aerodynamics, building his first experimental wings alongside his brother. Though they failed, he persisted, testing gliders, monoplanes, biplanes, and curved wing designs, gradually drawing closer to mastering the balance of the air. At the age of 30, he married Agnes Fischer, with whom he had 4 children. He loved his family, yet never stopped dedicating time and resources to understanding flight. He was not wealthy, but his business manufacturing machines and steam boilers allowed him to finance his experiments without depending on governments or kings. After years of study, beginning in 1891, he carried out more than 2,000 flights from hills near Derwitz and Kralow. His first gliders were made of ash wood and fabric, imitating the structure of bird wings. For his most important tests, he built an artificial hill called Fliegeberg, about 15 meters high, from which he launched himself again and again. People began to see him as a strange mix between a mad scientist and a pioneer. Some mocked him, while others admired him. When Otto flew, he made the air his pathway, controlling balance by shifting his body, much like modern paragliders do today. However, on the morning of August 9th, 1896, in Sturm, during a flight with a new glider, the wind changed suddenly. He lost control and fell from a height of around 17 meters. Still conscious, he was transported by train in the hope that one of Europe's most prestigious surgeons could treat him. But it was already too late. On August 10th, 1896, he died at the age of 48, leaving behind his wife, his 4 children, and an idea. His final words were, "Opfer müssen gebracht werden." Sacrifices must be made. He was buried in Berlin, at the public cemetery of Lankwitz. For him, flight was not a dream, but a real pursuit. And without knowing it, he opened the path for those who would conquer the skies after him. These were the final breaths of the 19th century, a contrast between a world that was ending and another that was just beginning. The sky still belonged to birds, myths, and balloons that could rise but could not move forward with control. In a small bicycle workshop in the United States, 2 brothers were preparing to prove that floating was not enough. Wilbur and Orville Wright were born into a humble family, but one deeply rooted in curiosity and imagination. They were born 4 years apart, yet lived as if they were inseparable. Their home was in Dayton, Ohio, although for a time they lived in Richmond, Indiana. It was not a large city, but it was filled with factories, inventors, mechanical workshops, and local newspapers that spoke of progress. It was the perfect environment for restless minds. Their parents formed an exceptional combination. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop who owned a vast library that taught them to think and question. Their mother, Susan Catherine Kerner, had skills in mechanics and carpentry. From her, they learned how to observe, build, and repair. One day, their father gave them a small flying toy with a rubber-powered propeller based on a French design. It was simple, made of paper and cork, but when they saw it rise into the air, something inside them changed forever. As the years passed, while others dreamed of wealth, they dreamed of gears, ink, and mechanisms. At the age of 17, Orville left school before completing his basic studies and founded a small printing shop. Shortly afterward, his brother Wilbur joined him. They began printing a local newspaper and later built their own printing presses. Later on, they left the printing business and opened a bicycle shop, taking advantage of the decade's growing popularity of bicycles. They designed, repaired, and perfected every model. Without realizing it, they were already refining the tools they would one day use. Wilbur was thoughtful, planned calmly, and reflected deeply. Orville was restless, creative, and practical. Together, they complemented each other perfectly. In 1896, both brothers began seriously exploring a subject that had surrounded them since childhood: human flight. They were inspired by the studies of the German Otto Lilienthal, pioneer of glider flight. Wilbur wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution requesting scientific information about flight. They studied, debated, and questioned everything that was known at the time. In 1899, they designed their first experimental glider near their home in Dayton, Ohio, and at their bicycle workshop. It was small and lightweight, made of wood, fabric, and wires held under tension. Their goal was to test a system that would allow them to slightly tilt the wings in order to maintain balance in the air. That small kite confirmed that the control system worked, at least in theory, and they decided to take the next step. 1 year later, they took the idea to a larger scale, built their first glider, and tested it in a town called Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They chose that area because of its constant winds and soft terrain for landing. Many tests were carried out without a pilot, using sandbags, and at other times they flew it themselves. However, the glider did not generate the expected lift, and the calculations did not match reality. In 1901, They created a second improved glider, but the results remained inconsistent. They discovered that previous data, including that of Otto Lilienthal and the Smeaton coefficient, were not entirely accurate. To solve the problem, they returned to Dayton that same year and built their own wind tunnel, redefining the foundations of aerodynamics. Their friend and mechanic, Charlie Taylor, worked alongside the brothers, handling repairs and helping with the construction of the tunnel. In 1902, after gathering new data and improving the design, they returned to Kitty Hawk. During that season with the third glider, hundreds of short flights lasting only a few seconds were carried out. They understood that balance was just as important as lift. Thus, the principle of three-axis control was born, the foundation of modern flight. With flight control finally solved, the next challenge was propulsion. In 1903, with the help of their mechanic Charlie Taylor, they built a lightweight 12-horsepower engine and integrated it into a new design based on their most advanced glider. Thus, a machine with full control was born, baptized as the Flyer. For days, they waited for the right wind, watched the sky, and calmly discussed every decision. They knew that attempt could fail like so many others before it. On the morning of December 17, 1903, the wind blew cold and steady across the sand. There were no speeches, only a silent agreement. Orville would go first. Wilbur walked beside the wing, stabilizing the machine while the engine vibrated with uneven force. It was 10:35 in the morning. The Flyer lifted from the ground and remained in the air for 12 seconds, traveling 36 meters. That day, they completed 4 flights. The last one, piloted by Wilbur, traveled 260 meters in 59 seconds. It was the first sustained and controlled flight of a powered machine. After landing, a powerful gust of wind overturned the aircraft, leaving it damaged, but humanity had already flown. There was no applause or recognition. In fact, no one believed their achievement. They tried to offer their invention, especially to the military, since at that time, only governments could finance technology of that level. But their proposal was initially rejected. The brothers kept testing in silence, far from giving up, in a field near Dayton. They improved the Flyer because it could take off, but it was still unstable and difficult to control. In 1904, the Flyer 2 was no longer new, but an improved version capable of staying in the air longer and landing with control. They were no longer trying only to rise into the air, but to turn and maneuver. Finally, in 1905, after years of testing, the Flyer 3 achieved sustained and stable flights, lasting more than 30 minutes, becoming the first practical airplane in history. But they did not reveal it publicly. They kept the invention relatively private while seeking contracts. In 1908, the brothers separated to demonstrate their machine. Each one would operate his own aircraft, both based on the evolution of the Flyer 3. Wilbur traveled to France, where interest in aviation was beginning to grow. His demonstrations, elegant, controlled, and prolonged, left the European press astonished. Meanwhile, in the United States, Orville stayed behind to respond to a military call for proposals. They were not looking for an experiment, but for a practical machine capable of meeting a series of requirements, including reaching minimum speeds and maintaining full control. The call attracted multiple proposals, but almost none met the required standards. After an evaluation process, the Army signed a conditional agreement with the Wright Brothers. They would receive the full contract only if they proved that their machine could fly in a sustained and controlled manner. Thus began the tests at Fort Myer, Virginia. After several days of successful demonstrations, during one of the flights on September 17th of that same year, one of the propellers fractured. The aircraft lost control and crashed to the ground. Orville survived, but was seriously injured. He was immediately transported to the military hospital in Washington, D.C. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, died hours later from his injuries. The news crossed the ocean. Their sister Catherine, who worked and cared for the family home, traveled immediately from Dayton to take care of him. Although she is rarely mentioned, her presence was essential to the emotional balance of the project. In letters, contracts, and difficult moments, she was there. When he heard the news, Wilbur interrupted his demonstrations in Europe to reunite with his brother. During the most difficult months, they remained together until Orville, after a slow recovery, was finally able to stand again. The accident did not stop the project. Months later, the Wright brothers fulfilled the military requirements for duration and speed. They signed contracts and sold the rights to use their invention in different countries, establishing themselves as pioneers. They founded the Wright Company in 1909, training new pilots and transforming flight into a real discipline, thus laying the foundation for modern aviation. Wilbur died in 1912, at the age of 45, from typhoid fever. Orville lived a little longer to witness the development of military aviation. He died in 1948 at the age of 76 from a heart attack. Both died in the same city where their dream began. Neither of the two ever married. They dedicated their lives to flight, and when the world finally discovered them, one had already departed early, and the other lived long enough to see fabric wings transformed into wings of steel. Time passed, and the Wright brothers had taken flight one step further. Flying was no longer a dream, but something greater. By 1911, France and Germany were already developing aviation for military purposes. Soon after, the first experiments with aerial weaponry began. During the war, the airplane would become a weapon produced on a massive scale. On July 28, 1914, the First World War erupted. Before it, there were barely any pilot schools in the world. Some learned on their own, while others trained in the middle of combat. And while some celebrated its military usefulness and others learned to fly, people like the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont, who had dreamed of using flight to unite humanity, mourned its misuse. At first, airplanes were used for observation and aerial photography, but they were soon adapted to drop light bombs over trenches, supply depots, and cities. After 4 years of combat, on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, ending the war. Later, the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe limitations on Germany, forcing it to dismantle much of its military aviation. Many airplanes were destroyed, dismantled, or handed over to the Allies. Engineers and pilots became inactive, although some continued working in secret. Thousands of aircraft remained stored in hangars across France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. There was not enough civilian demand, and many airplanes were unsafe or too low in quality to transport passengers. Some were disarmed and converted into training aircraft for civilian and military pilots. A small number were adapted for airmail service, but the cabins were open and lacked heating or comfort. The United States entered the war late and manufactured French and British models under license. After the conflict, many airplanes were sold at low prices, and some pilots used them in aerial acrobatics shows, helping to promote civil aviation during the 1920s. In 1919, the first airlines emerged. At first they were noisy, with open cabins, no bathrooms, and very few seats, but they represented a revolution compared to trains or ships. Technical innovations advanced rapidly, and in less than a decade, engines became more reliable and powerful. Open cabins were transformed into enclosed cabins with windows. Wood was gradually replaced by aluminum, structures became stronger, and aircraft more aerodynamic. Radios and ground beacons were introduced for night flights. The economic crisis of 1929 did not stop the growth of commercial aviation, although it reduced investments and expansion. Even so, airlines survived and laid the foundation for the great modern air carriers. The world was already watching airplanes cross oceans and transport mail between continents. But traditional aviation still had a limitation. Many places had no landing strips, making it both a technical challenge and a military necessity. Although Paul Cornu in France in 1907 and Juan de la Cierva in Spain in 1920 carried out early attempts, a practical helicopter still did not exist. Heinrich Fokker and Gerd Achgelis developed the Fokker-Wulf FW-61, whose first experimental flight took place in 1936 in Bremen, Germany. They demonstrated that vertical flight could be stable, and in 1938 they presented it publicly by flying inside a closed stadium, something astonishing for the time. 3 years later, in 1939, the Russian-born American Igor Sikorsky flew the VS-300 in the United States, the first helicopter with a main rotor and tail rotor for control. Its first flight took place on September 14th of that year, establishing the definitive modern helicopter model. Thus, the helicopter was born. At first it seemed fragile and limited, but it became an essential tool for rescue missions. For humanity, one world war was not enough. 21 years later, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began. Governments once again invested millions for military purposes, developing more powerful engines, radar systems, pressurized cabins, and lightweight materials. Aircraft were designed for strategic bombing and aerial combat, as well as transporting troops and supplies, conducting reconnaissance missions, and carrying out aerial espionage. Before the war, the United States, the Soviet Union, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Japan already had advanced prototypes. As a result, aircraft became far more lethal. We went from chasing a dream to facing a nightmare. Airplanes once again became essential weapons for escort missions and cargo transport. After 6 years of combat, everything ended on September 2nd, 1945. Commercial aviation took advantage of the technological momentum left behind by the conflict. A massive military surplus remained, even larger than the one left in 1918. By the late 1940s, many military aircraft were converted into passenger planes, and advancements began focusing on luxury and travel comfort. After the war, numerous pilots brought their combat experience into the emerging civilian airlines. Some airlines offered international commercial flights, and in most cases, a ticket cost more than an automobile. Aircraft now featured pressurized cabins and luxury services, including meals, drinks, and onboard attention. Traveling by airplane became an expensive and exclusive experience, seen as a luxury for only a few. However, flights involved many stopovers, along with noise and turbulence. In the early 1950s, the jet appeared. The first civilian jet aircraft faced major problems, as the metal weakened from repeated pressurized flights. By the 1960s, the jet was no longer a novelty. The number of passengers grew steadily, and flying stopped being a privilege. During the 1970s, aircraft with more seating capacity and new commercial strategies made air travel accessible to millions. The wings that once carried bombs now carried suitcases. The sky was no longer only for war, but also for traveling across the world. But even though the war had ended, the world would not find peace, as two superpowers emerged like giants with opposing ideas. They did not fight with direct weapons, but with technology, ideology, and pride. Both nations wanted to dominate the future, and that future was not on Earth, but in space. At the end of the Second World War, Germany developed the V-2 rocket under the direction of Wernher von Braun, a mechanical and aerospace engineer who was later taken to the United States through Operation Paperclip. This operation allowed scientists, technological advances, designs, and experimental vehicles to be transferred and integrated into the new space programs. But they were not the only ones. The Soviet Union also sought to reach space first, and struck the first blow on October 4, 1957, by launching the artificial satellite Sputnik 1 into Earth's orbit. Almost a month later, on November 3rd of that same year, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 with Laika, a stray dog, to study the effects of space travel, making her the first living being in space. A year later, in 1958, the United States responded by creating NASA and launching the satellite Explorer 1 on January 31st. Thanks to the scientific instrumentation led by James Van Allen, the radiation belts surrounding Earth were discovered. 3 years later, the Soviet Union responded by sending Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human being to travel into space aboard Vostok 1 in 1961. Between 1958 and 1963, the United States accelerated the development of the Mercury program, with the objective of studying whether humans could operate under zero-gravity conditions for extended periods. The Gemini program served as a bridge between the Mercury and Apollo programs, preparing astronauts for orbital maneuvers, docking procedures, and spacewalks. Each mission provided essential data for the next step. On July 16, 1969, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin were launched aboard Apollo 11. After 4 days of travel, they managed to walk on the lunar surface. What happened on that July 20th marked the world, although not everyone saw it the same way. After humanity arrived on the Moon, the Soviet Union continued with its programs, developing permanent space stations in low Earth orbit, but it failed to match that achievement, leaving the United States as the victorious power. The space race did not begin out of love for knowledge, but as a symbol of power and technological control. What happened in space reflected what was happening on Earth. Decades later, in 1998, the International Space Station was born, a joint project between several nations and a symbol of cooperation after years of rivalry. But even the greatest symbols are not eternal. Its decommissioning is planned for the year 2030, thus closing one of the most important chapters of humanity in space. This brings us to the present day, where the concept of flight is present in almost every aspect of life. In drones, which allow aerial filming, crop spraying, transporting packages in experimental tests, tracking animal species without disturbing them, and studying glaciers, volcanoes, and forests. Although not yet widespread, jetpacks already allow people to fly for several minutes, and some pilots have even crossed the English Channel flying between France and England. With the arrival of artificial intelligence, flights may no longer depend on a pilot, allowing transportation guided by algorithms. Among the new forms of aerial mobility expected in the coming years are air taxis, designed to make landings easier on parks or rooftops. In the past, rocket launchers were extremely expensive because the equipment could only be used once. Today, the key is reusability. This led to entrepreneurs developing ambitious projects capable of landing again on ocean platforms or on land. Some focused on suborbital tourism flights. With these advances, it is expected that more and more people will be able to pay to spend a few minutes in space. Among the conceptual projects being considered are lunar bases, the colonization of Mars, and private stations that could eventually become space hotels. But as we move closer to this dream, it seems we understand its consequences less and less. More than 100,000 flights take off every day around the world. Every space launch consumes tons of fuel and releases greenhouse gases. The noise from launches disturbs nearby wildlife, and some rocket parts fall into rural areas, contaminating them with toxic materials, while others remain orbiting Earth as space debris. Today, flight is a business, but the sky is not a limit, it is a field of study. To understand it, humanity needed something more than wings, a new tool, not for movement, but for observation. And that is what we will discover in our next volume, because flight was never the end, it was only the beginning.